Good morning. Welcome to episode 104 of Duval Rundown. My name is Gus Logue. Today I'm joined by a very special guest. His name is Zach Goodall. He covers the Florida Gators for 24/7 Sports. You might have heard of Zach from his work last year covering the Jaguars for Jaguars Wire under USA Today, or previously Big Cat Country under SB Nation. And so, Zach, we're former neighborhood buddies, former bus buddies, former lunch table buddies. So it's pretty surreal to be here today. You definitely helped pave the path for me, but I'm excited to talk ball with you today. Welcome to the show, Zach.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me. I'm excited to be on here too, man. This is nearly 20 years in the making, really. It's kind of crazy when you think about it like that.
Definitely. I definitely remember specifically at the lunch table, Zach, or as we used to call him, Goody, talking about how he was talking to someone on the phone named Alfie Crow, and we all thought that was a made-up name, but obviously Alfie was pretty much co-founder, but the site manager for a really long time at Big Cat Country. Shout out to Alfie. Shout out for Zach for getting into the sports media industry before even graduating high school. But yeah, we're not going to be talking about high school. We'll mostly be talking about professional football. But first, I wanted to talk about, before we get into some Gators prospects that you have certainly more information on than me, did want to ask you about the Gators' basketball season, because even though I know you primarily cover football for 24/7 Sports, but obviously you were doing work covering the Gators' national championship run. And so just to kind of knock that off or out of the way, I just wanted your thoughts on what that experience was like on the whole, where it kind of stacks up in terms of other seasons that you've covered, and any particular moments that really stood out to you as you were covering the team.
Yeah, it was pretty miraculous. And yeah, like you mentioned, I'm not primarily our basketball guy. My background's largely football. So we've had Graham Hall, he's been on the road, SEC tournament, the whole NCAA tournament. He's been at every game, leading that coverage for us. But I mean, yeah, I viewed it as miraculous, winning their last 12 and what was it? I think 18 of their last 19 games too, largely just cruising through SEC play at that point, obviously into the SEC tournament. And then to pull off 4 comeback wins of their 6 in the NCAA tournament, there were the nerves, right? And even the Connecticut game, there were moments where you're thinking, oh, really, this really might be over and going Connecticut's way. This is the team that's been there, done this a million times at this point under Dan Hurley. And then Florida pulls off that comeback with those shots from Walter Clayton Jr., including just some of his absurd takes that he puts up that only he is going to put in. And you realize then, oh, okay, this team is capable of fighting through adversity and pulling off these impressive wins. And then they really do it again against Maryland, even though they won that game handily in the end. It was contested really through the middle, and it required players separating. I believe they had 4 players in double digits in that game. Texas Tech, same deal as Connecticut, the comeback win, Walter Clayton, he'll hit down any shot that you need him to. And they just kept doing that against Auburn. And really, I guess you could argue most notably here against Houston, down 8 at halftime, down as many as 12, I believe, with 15 left. And you just knew based on their previous wins, how they were never out of it. There was always a chance for them to come back and win this game. And then they do it in just astonishing fashion in the final minute 20, with Houston committing 4 turnovers and Florida, whatever exactly the run was at that point. It was just the tale of the season that you could never count this team out. They had been slept on a lot. I think that they felt that way. I think especially coming into the tournament as well, a 1 seed, the lowest rated 1 seed. They had a chip on their shoulder there really the entire run, and I think that paved the way for them to pull the ball down.
Yeah, the resiliency definitely stood out, especially for how young might not be the right term, even if Todd Golden is the youngest coach to win a championship since Jimmy V. But they, especially their backcourt, had plenty of kind of veteran or experienced players, and players with great leadership, from Will Richard to even Walter Clayton to Elijah Martin, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact that they're not UConn, they're not back-to-back champions. They haven't really been there in a while. Obviously, it was their first Final Four in about a decade. And so the fact that they showed their resiliency, not just in the first and the second round, but every single round, yeah, I felt like I wasn't really able to catch my breath until even after the final whistle against Houston. But definitely a very fun season. But that's enough basketball talk for now. I've distracted our listeners enough with me praising the Gators. So let's talk more about Gators, but through a football lens. So the Gators have certainly a handful of NFL draft prospects in this 2025 NFL draft, but they don't really have anyone that's expected to be taken on day one or day two. From what I see on kind of general consensus boards, the top two players that are typically taken are offensive lineman Brandon Crenshaw Dixon and then defensive tackle Cam Jackson. And so, just what can you tell me about either of those players and whether you like kind of not necessarily whether you like their chances to succeed in the NFL, but like what their path would be to succeeding in the NFL?
Yeah, I mean, like to give the class from Florida like an overarching view, and granted, there's biases to take into account here, but around here, people think that kind of the same deal. It would be there's no chance that anyone in this class is going in round one. I think that's safe to say. There's a chance that Florida doesn't really have much action on day two either. Maybe a couple guys sneak into whether it's the late second or into the third, but their thinking here is that Florida could maybe even lead the NFL draft in day three picks based on the purely the number of guys that are coming out, long-term contributors, whether to Florida or transferred in and had really good seasons at Florida. And Cam Jackson and Brendan Crenshaw Dixon fit into the latter category. Jackson for 2 seasons, Crenshaw Dixon for 1. Jackson came in as Florida's starting nose tackle. I think they realized 2 years into the Desmond Watson experience that they needed someone else to come in and take some snaps off his plate. And Cam Jackson was able to do that. He's a big-bodied, forget where the NFL Combine had him, but I know while he was at Florida, he was 6'6", 340. He might have gotten down to around 328. So he's just a physically imposing, really big player with a little bit of pass rush upside. But obviously, I think you're getting him in there for the early down situations. And he does well. Like, I don't necessarily think he's going to consistently demand double teams even at his size, but he's athletic enough to do it, to demand some attention. And even with that, there's a little bit of pass rushing upside to where there will be certain situations, certain packages you can put him in where at least he's going to be able to collapse the pocket a bit purely based on just how big he is. I mean, this guy's a big dude. We talk about how big Desmond Watson is, and obviously everyone else will fall by the wayside there, but Cam Jackson's a legitimate, like, huge physical presence and probably one of the bigger nose tackles in this draft too. Brendan Crenshaw Dixon, 1 year transfer from San Diego State, where he had a really polished career, really good in pass protection out there, and he largely was able to do the same for Florida. I think that this offensive line as a whole just, I hate to say it peaked, because I mean they're bringing 4 starters back this year, but I mean there was just significant growth across the board for this unit, and I think that his experience was part of that, even coming from a little bit lower competition out there at San Diego State, jumping into the SEC. He held his own in pass protection. He's not the most athletic tackle prospect. I think his combine and pro day numbers suggest that there's really not a ton to work with there, so the upside is limited. But at a minimum, someone's getting a player with thousands of snaps really under their belt at this point, who's accomplished quite a bit in multiple conferences. He brings in good size. He's got decent length. He's probably worth a flyer, I think, on day 3 as well. But the athleticism is probably going to handicap what you can get out of him.
Totally. All right. So Brandon Crenshaw Dixon and Cam Jackson, certainly names to watch out for on day 3. The I think biggest name in this draft class for the Gators, at least from my perspective, is Jason Marshall Jr., the cornerback, who a year ago at this time, or I guess 11 months ago at this time, so after last year's draft, when I was doing like way too early NFL mocks, Jason Marshall was the guy that I was mocking to the Gators or to the Jaguars in like the first or the second round. And it wasn't just me having Gators bias. I mean, there was the bias because I was taking him, but it wasn't biased because like he was generally known as like a first or second round caliber prospect. And so now he's more so expected to be a day 3 guy, maybe even a priority free agent. And so like what exactly happened with Jason Marshall, and do you still see a path for him succeeding in the NFL?
Yeah, people might forget just because his career didn't pan out, I think, the way people envisioned. But he was, if he didn't finish the class as the number 1 corner, he was top 2 or 3 For a long time, a 5-star consensus 5-star prospect, even in the class of 2021. Maybe Dan Mullen's biggest and last win on the recruiting trail for Florida, even. So like that's how far back we're going here at this point. But he came in and he played immediately. And I think that there's been a lot of promising play out of him over his 4 years at Florida, 3.5 because he missed the second half of last season with a shoulder injury. Strong man coverage corner, really physical. And he's not made enough plays on the ball, I don't think, compared to what people expected out of him coming out. But he's still largely, he broke up a good number of passes while he was at Florida. He just didn't really pick the ball off that much. And I think he's always had fairly strong coverage numbers in terms of, allowing completions. The athleticism kind of was always the concern on a similar note, I guess, to Brandon Crenshaw-Dixon, although obviously much different. And the combine kind of validated that when he came out and ran, I think, a 4.54 at the start, and then he was able to get that number down to 4.49. But still, for a former 5-star corner with the size that he brings to the table and some other impressive results, like his vertical was pretty good. It was 37.5. But people were expecting more speed. And then for him to go to Florida's Pro Day where you have to add 0.2 of a second maybe, but he runs a 4.43 there. It compensates. It certainly helps. But at this point, too, it's a little bit overshadowed because when he went into the combine, he just that number that came out for him, while he's a bigger player, I mean, he's 6 flat, 195 to 200. So it's not like he's some massive corner either. And that time just wasn't really going to work. So I see the upside. I think that he can come in and be a solid number 3 corner, maybe a number 2 in some systems if he hits. But kind of a similar deal. And you're going to see that, I think, with a lot of Florida's class, aside from some exceptions. Like there are athletic limitations on some of these guys, and it kind of lowers their ceiling a little bit. And for Jason Marshall, you'd think coming out that the ceiling would be the floor, or the floor would be the ceiling, however that saying is supposed to go as a 5-star. But yeah, so far, I don't think he's necessarily lived up to his potential, and maybe an NFL team will be able to get that out of him.
Well, I think that was a really good explanation, and especially in terms of the athleticism, because I was just pulling up his RAS score, his relative athletic score, and it's a 9.04. Hey, shout out Duval out of 10, which sounds really good. It ranks 239th out of 2,500 cornerbacks since 1987. And so from a very general standpoint, like I could see fans being like, oh, like, well, maybe his career at Florida didn't really end the way that anyone wanted it to. But if he's scoring a 9.04 RAS, he must be a really good athlete. And that's like the kind of guy worth taking a swing on in day 3. And not that he isn't worth taking a swing on in day 3, but as you said, like his size is really good. He did have some really good broad jump and a good vertical jump, but the speed isn't really there from both like the 40-yard dash to the 20-yard split to the 10-yard split. Just like doesn't have the athleticism that you really need to hang with NFL starting caliber wide receivers. And so that makes a lot of sense to me. The next guy I had on my list was the receiver, DK. I don't know how to pronounce that first name. Do you?
Chimray.
Chimray. All right, Chimray.
They call him Chim. Yeah.
All right, tell me about him, because I've seen him pop up a little bit on like on social media of like, oh, get this guy into like a Shanahan type offense where he can just run digs and crossers and just kind of deep crossing routes over the middle of the field. And so, like, is that the role that you envision for him? And just your thoughts on him in general.
Yeah, that's exactly what I envisioned for him, actually. I kind of saw him as more of a possession guy coming out. I was blown away by his combine results. I certainly did not think he was going to clock a 4.34. Yeah. Because that athleticism, like while he's athletic, I don't think that kind of speed has ever really shown up on his tape. He wasn't necessarily the consistent big play threat for Florida. I would argue that was a bit more Elijah Badger, who's also in this class. But more of your guy that you can throw it to on second and third down when you need to move the chains, and he'll pull that off. And granted, Billy Napier is not the biggest fan of throwing past the chains on third down, but that's a story for another day. Yet Chim was able to do it, and certainly teams are going to bet now on these numbers. And we've heard after the fact from Florida that it was something that Chim really worked on throughout the entire season, that his velocity numbers, his miles per hour on the GPS system that they have in practice, consistently improved really since the day he got to Florida. And maybe that's more of a how Florida is doing things compared to how Wisconsin was doing things. You can look at his former quarterback with the Badgers and Graham Mertz and maybe make a similar argument too, just from a production standpoint. I think it's hard to argue that he was not better at Florida than he was at Wisconsin. But yeah, I still I don't see him necessarily as a receiver who could run the entire route tree. At least that wasn't something that he showed at Florida or Wisconsin, really, for that matter. Maybe there's still something to untap there as a result of him running a 4.34 and doing what he did. But I think he's one of the players that you more know what you're getting in a possession receiver, and to put him into a West Coast E kind of offense like what Shanahan operates, I think would be a pretty solid fit.
That makes sense. There's certainly a handful of other names out there. You just mentioned Graham Mertz. There's running back Montrell Johnson. You also mentioned Desmond Watson, a.k.a. Big Dez, the nose tackle. Is there anyone else that I haven't asked you about that you're going to certainly be keeping your eye on in terms of where they land in like the beginning of their NFL careers, or do you think we've kind of hit all the big names?
One that you mentioned in Montrell Johnson kind of fascinates me because I guess it's kind of similar to DK's. Like, I didn't necessarily see that athleticism on tape. He had some breakaway runs for Florida, no doubt, but I never really saw a 4.42 rusher. You've got that now, and you consider he averaged, I want to say, 130 carries a season in his college career. So like the wear and tear really isn't like, it's not that bad. I mean, whether it was Trevor Etienne splitting the load with him for 2 seasons, or this past season, Jaden Baugh and Jacoby Jackson doing it too. And granted, Johnson had an injury that kept him out a couple games, but his usage, I mean, I would think, especially compared to some of the other backs in this class, is appealing. It's some team's going to want to take a shot on that. And you know, after Ashton Genty at the top of the class, and I guess like 1 or 2 other guys there, I feel like, and this is something that happens every year, the running back class kind of plateaus and teams just take their guy. And at this point now, I wouldn't necessarily be shocked if Montrell Johnson maybe sneaks into the 3rd or early 4th and maybe surprises some people, but just where teams are picking running backs and you can't really predict it. On the other side, someone you didn't mention, Triquez Bridges is someone I'm keeping an eye on. He transferred to Florida from Oregon last year, where he was there for 4 or 5 years. They primarily had him at cornerback. He was a high school safety prospect coming out, but he had lengthy, I think 6'2", 195, pretty good arm length. They moved him outside, where he was kind of up and down. He was kind of a spot starter, took on a starting role, was relegated a bit. He comes to Florida. They move him back to safety. Provides some pretty, solid play there back next to Jordan Castell as they were kind of rotating through safeties throughout the season. And then injuries started popping up at corner with Devin Moore going out, Jason Marshall, like we mentioned, going out. Dijon Johnson had to step into the lineup there at the end, but he had an injury at the end of the season. And it just made it easy for Bridges to go back to a spot that he knew at Oregon, playing in a somewhat similar system under Dan Lanning compared to what Florida tries to run on defense. And it worked. He finished the season with, I want to say, 2 interceptions and I think a team-leading 8 pass breakups. And then he goes out to Florida's Pro Day, and again, accounting for Pro Day times, maybe add a little bit to it, but runs the best time there in a 4.38. It certainly made it look silly on the NFL Combine to not include him among the 9 or 10 Florida prospects that were invited, because you look at his production compared to some of the other players in Florida's class who were invited, even just going back to his time at Oregon, and like it's some of the best of their group. So he's one that I'm keeping an eye on. I don't necessarily view him as someone that'll like come off super early, but he was kind of giving the idea of undraftable or not likely to be drafted based on the way his season was going. And then he goes up and he shines at Florida's Pro Day. I'm thinking now that he probably will be a day 3 pick. And I know that there are guys like ESPN's Mel Kiper has hyped him up a good bit throughout the draft process too. So he's got some fans. It's just a little bit more under the radar compared to some of these other guys.
Love that. With all that said, to transition it into Jaguars talk, are any of these guys, do you think, like really good on paper fits for the Jaguars specifically? And if not necessarily, is there just anyone really in the draft class that you really like as a fit for the Jags, whether it's Mason Graham at 5th overall or some guy that we've never heard of from Arizona State or something in the 7th round.
I mean, maybe DK, right? With their need at receiver. And I'm thinking that this is kind of a double dip situation because they're probably going to have to take someone in round 2, I would think, to add to that room. I would say Badger too, but I mean, you've kind of got your big play guys already in Brian Thomas and now Dynami Brown. Dynami? Did I get it right? Is that it?
Diami.
Whatever it is. Diami. DK would make sense. I think Jason Marshall would still make sense if you're trying to add depth to your cornerback room, but it is kind of with this class, just again, like it's lower ceiling. It's kind of hard to find ideal fits because each of these guys has something that you could kind of pick apart. I mean, I don't necessarily see a productive NFL career in his future, but if Jacksonville wants to bring in another quarterback, even after signing Nick Mullins in free agency, just to have a camp arm, maybe a practice squad developmental guy. Graham Mertz is 24. I know that that's not really an attractive thing in the draft process, but I think Jacksonville at this point would benefit from having passers with experience on its roster and maybe some with a little bit more upside than what we've seen the past couple of years out of the backup room. So Mertz is someone that I think would make sense for Jacksonville or anyone else to bring in as at least a camp arm and see what you got.
Totally. And I think that Jacksonville as a whole will probably be looking for more of like the high floor, lower ceiling guys. Obviously, especially like as the draft goes on, just because after the 1st and 2nd and 3rd rounds, there's not a lot of high upside guys available anymore. But I think like throughout the entire draft, Jacksonville, because they want to raise the floor of the roster quickly, but also I think even if they were maybe not if they were contending for championships, they would be a little bit more aggressive. But certainly at this point in their team building, they want to get on base and they want to hit a lot of singles and doubles. And so I feel like Crenshaw Dixon makes sense to me, honestly, as a guy that, like, even if he doesn't have great athleticism and that kind of limits his ceiling because of his vast experience playing college football, not just being in college football for a long time, but actually getting snaps and experience on the field. I think the Jaguars will be looking for those types of guys and be more willing to take guys that are really experienced and even older prospects, probably more so than most NFL teams. And so really, I think a lot of the names that we brought up today could potentially make sense for the Jaguars, either in day 3 or in undrafted free agency. But before I let you go, I do want to get your thoughts on the 5th overall pick. So not related to the Gators at all, but obviously I know you have Jaguars expertise from covering the team last year and covering the team for several seasons as a whole in the past. And so do you have I guess it would be pretty fair if you didn't have a hot take, since the very general consensus is that the Jags will probably be taking Mason Graham. And so do you think that he should be talked about as he is, as like just a no thinker, no brainer pick for the Jaguars? And I guess regardless of your answer on that, what is there like a sleeper option that you would potentially like if, say, Mason Graham was off the board at 4th overall to the Patriots?
Yeah, I mean, I really like Mason Graham. I don't necessarily view him as like the sure thing that a lot of people have, although I do think that he can come in and maybe even make himself worth the 5th overall pick when we look back in hindsight. Again, a high floor kind of player, and if that's what Jacksonville's looking for, and I think all signs suggest at this point that is what they're doing, he makes a ton of sense. I don't think you pass up on Travis Hunter if he's there, even if in this crazy reality that I'm making up, both of them are there. I've dropped this in a chat, I think, with you the other day, and I guess it's kind of hot. Not really. I would not take any of the offensive linemen at 5. And like, that is not for me to suggest that I'm confident in where Jacksonville's offensive line is right now. I find personally that their free agent class on offensive linemen was a bit disappointing, even with the number of people they brought in the deal that they handed Macari. I think that there's a lot of work left to do there, but now you are just like, I mean, how many bodies are we thinking are already going to make this roster unless they make some surprise cuts based purely on the guys they signed, the extensions they've handed out? You know, there's a logjam across this offensive line, and that's not to suggest that rookies wouldn't come in and beat out even some of these signings, but to then turn around and use your first round top 5 pick on another offensive lineman, to me, would be a bit of a waste of resources. Like, I view the need certainly being the interior still, even after what they've done there. I would sooner trade back into the very late first for cost control on the 5th year, or move up in the second if need be for an interior lineman who falls, whether it's Tyler Booker, whether it's Zabel, right? Did I get his name right, from North Dakota State, or some of those players? Like Will Campbell's a great player. I think there are some penalty issues that come up from the lack of length. That again, conversation for another day. And some of these other linemen at the top of the class are worth a number 5 overall pick. But for Jacksonville at this point, I think that the resource would be better used elsewhere now, just based on how they've approached this offseason. They can get better offensive linemen into day 2.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And I think it's a really good point, like across the entire roster, honestly, because like the Jags already have 5 offensive linemen they could hypothetically start week 1 and feel pretty comfortable with, and certainly several backups there too. There's also other position groups where it's like running back, they'll probably draft a running back, but they don't really need to because they have 2 solid guys. Safety is a position that we've talked about a lot on the show, but they do have 5 safeties already on the roster. And so like on one hand, I think they definitely need a playmaker, but on the other hand, if they do draft a safety really at any point, then that could lead to a surprising cut. Cornerback is another one where I think that they shouldn't be shy to like upgrade in the draft at really any round out after the first round. But like they've already got a lot of signed guys. This is, as everyone in the building would say, not a 4-13 team on paper. And so it'll be interesting, especially because James Gladstone said that despite the Jaguars already having the most picks in this draft of any other team, they're going to be looking to get even more picks and get more at-bats at the plate. And so it'll be really interesting to see like just the 53-man roster shakeout, I guess, regardless of the positions, because, again, for multiple position groups, it's going to be an interesting battle between some like notable veterans that we all kind of know the name of versus even day 3 rookies. So last question for you, Zach, before we let you go is we talked about the Gators, talked about the first round for the Jaguars. You said that you wouldn't necessarily prioritize offensive line in the first round. Beyond the trenches, because I think that we can all agree that like just trenches in general is a really big need for Jacksonville. What non-trenches position would you really like to see them fill in the draft in the second or third round, whether it be a pass catcher or a running back or someone in the secondary, something like that?
Definitely a wide receiver. And I know that like there's been the dark horse talk of like Tyler Warren at 5 or going tight end early. I really see no point in doing that at all. I don't think this offense is going to feature tight ends very often. And now again, like logjam there. Brenton Strange is the one that I think garners a lot of attention, and rightfully so, from Jaguars fans. I think he's been impressive with the expectations that were there for him being a bit low coming in. I think that he's at least looked the part of a starting caliber tight end, maybe with a little bit limited upside. And then they go and sign all these guys in free agency too. And I think that there's a real path toward most of them, if not all, having a role. So no need for a tight end. Wide receiver, I mean, we saw it last season. I don't think that you can go out there with Gabe Davis as a starter for you really ever at this point now. And I know that they're kind of stuck with him for a bit, but like, I think you just got to find a way to move on quickly, even if that's putting him on the bench. He's just not, at least based on last year alone, was not capable of providing quality level snaps to you. And Brian Thomas obviously is the gem there. They're always going to be okay at the position as long as he's there and healthy. And Brown was a nice addition, I think, as a potential wide receiver 3, but I would certainly hope that their vision for him is not for him to be the 2. I think that they need to prioritize a 2. If a guy falls and they really like him, again, another, with all the picks that they have, even if they're trying to take more swings, like trade up. I would hope that this front office, especially coming from Los Angeles and working under Les Snead, like sees the value. And if you've got a ton of picks and you can go out and acquire a playmaker, or really anyone, like don't be afraid to go and make that move. And in this case, it could be, I guess, a veteran, although I think most of those moves are kind of behind us now at wide receiver. But move up and go get someone to pair with Ryan Thomas for the next 4 years, especially if it's in the second round, I guess, to where you don't need to give up a lot more to get into the first. But hey, that means that you got someone through Brian Thomas's 5th-year option that they can grow together and hopefully become a really dynamic pair. Whoever that receiver is, I'm not necessarily sure. And I know that they'll have quite a bit of options come the second round. But whoever I guess really identifies as someone that complements BTJ's skill set well, all of a sudden, that's a really young room, a dynamic room, likely, and one that you've got under cost control and on your roster for 4 years.
Yeah, I totally agree, especially with like considering that De'Ami Brown, like in the best case or the worst case scenario, it's kind of hard to imagine him being on the team past this year since he did only sign a 1-year contract. As you were saying, Gabe Davis, despite changing his number back to number 13, seems like he's probably going to be off of the roster as soon as the Jaguars are able to make it work financially. And so, yeah, I know that like Parker Washington is still hanging around, but like he's kind of like a slot only receiver, like a very specific niche for him to be able to succeed. He did have some pretty good stats when he lined up outside last year, but I kind of attributed that to kind of small sample size and noise, and like Mac Jones was starting a lot of those games, and obviously Doug Peterson was not interested really. And so, yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense to add receiver as early as the second round, or even to trade up into the first round. I definitely agree with, because even with the caveat of saying that Gladstone has said he wants to acquire more picks, and I definitely believe him when he says that. I think that the end of the first round would be the perfect place for the Jaguars to move up, because it would be not just a playmaker and like not just a good range for like kind of the second tier of receivers after Ted McMillan, but also to secure that 5th-year option and just have more security from the team standpoint with the contract. Yeah, we got on 32 minutes. Just you should try to go 20 or 30. So Zach, thanks so much. I don't know if you have any lingering takes or anything that you want to plug before we go.
If you guys are looking for Florida Gators coverage, and I'm going to try and dip my toes into the NFL draft as it pertains to that, it'll be all over at Swamp 247. But man, thank you for having me. This is a blast. I hope to come back on in the future.
Absolutely. We will definitely do that. Probably sometime this offseason, we'll have plenty of time to think of random things. We can do what we did last year with Shipley, maybe do another in-division mock. That was a lot of fun. But yeah, we'll find an excuse to have you back on. But really appreciate it, Zach. Take care, man.
Awesome. You too. Thank you.
All right. That was Zach Goodall, everyone. Go to Swamp 24/7 to catch his work. I will be back with Mia O'Brien tomorrow at 9:04 a.m. Eastern. We will be breaking down everything that we've heard from the Jaguars' press conferences that are happening today on Wednesday. I don't know why it froze when I was trying to exit out. I'm back, but now I'm gone. See you guys.